So the 2026 NBA Finals really seemed like a big breath of fresh air, and I think this is mainly because we had two very evenly matched teams in the Knicks and the Spurs who had already met in the NBA Cup previously in the season. So from that we could kind of gauge what we would get in this NBA Finals, because we had a little bit of a preview in the NBA Cup. Never mind how seriously you take that, because to be honest, not a lot of people take the NBA Cup seriously. I think they kind of see it as a bit of a pre-season tournament type thing. And we were also going to have a different champion for the 8th straight season, which makes the season very unpredictable, and you don't really know who's going to make the finals at the start of the season when this is happening. And it also plays into the whole parity thing, where it's a very even league and it's not obvious who's going to make the finals and who's going to win the NBA championship, which like 10 years ago we could probably guess that it would be the Warriors or the Cavaliers making the finals, or both of them. So the two teams, the New York Knicks and San Antonio Spurs, both, to be honest, had very different narratives coming into this NBA Finals, which does make for an even better finals, because it's kind of like one pinned up against the other. They don't have similar narratives. They're basically both completely different, and also both of the teams were very, very different as well. So going on to the Spurs, they are coming into a new era after the Greg Popovich and San Antonio Spurs had those 2 decades where they won 5 NBA championships. So the Spurs coming back into the finals do have a lot to live up to. And now they do have their new superstar in Victor Wembanyama, who is making his first NBA Finals appearance at just 22 years old. So there's a lot riding on this for him to perform well, and there's a lot riding on this for the Spurs as well, because they're basically back in the finals, I think, for the first time in like 10-12 years at this point. So this is a big thing for them, because now they've managed to basically rebuild a very good team and come back to where they were before. Also, this team is a very, very young one. Even though they do have a couple of veterans, a lot of the players here are basically in like their 20s, mid to early 20s, even though they do have a couple of veterans, which is very, very good for them, because those veterans are going to have the experience in the big games and in the playoffs like this. Even though those veterans might not be that great themselves, they can still provide some kind of insight into this, because even though they aren't those big superstar players, they've also been around those big superstar players, so they've seen kind of how they prepare, how they do in like certain scenarios and everything. So last season, the San Antonio Spurs ended up finishing 13th in the Western Conference with quite an underwhelming 34-48 record. However, Wembanyama was injured for like not the vast majority, for a lot of the season, and he was injured from late February for the rest of that season. So that is probably why the Spurs had a bit of an underwhelming record, due to the fact that Wembanyama was out for a large portion of the season. And even though I'm pretty sure they were on track to make the playoffs, I don't think they were really as bothered when Wembanyama went down injured. So yeah, that doesn't really surprise me that their record dropped off quite a bit last year. So now going on to the New York Knicks, they have a very, very different narrative to the San Antonio Spurs, and the Knicks obviously are a big market team. However, they have underperformed for years, and they hadn't won a championship in over 50 years. So this finals was big for them. I think this is the first time they had made the finals in a very, very long time. I think it must have been a few decades since they'd made the finals. And after years of being mocked by other fans for underachieving, because they'd had players like Carmelo Anthony, and they really hadn't been able to do much. So for the Knicks, this was more about getting New York back to the top of like the NBA landscape. And for them, they had a much older, more experienced team than the Spurs. Even though a lot of their players were like late 20s, early 30s, they have that experience going through the NBA season, getting knocked out in the playoffs, and also having to come back to try and improve on that. So they also have the playoff experience, and a big thing that I think probably went the Knicks' way in this finals was the fact that they had the starting players who have that experience. Yes, the Spurs had, I think, 1 or 2 players in the starting lineup that had that experience, but the Knicks more or less had their entire starting lineup with that. So I do think that would have played into their advantage, especially because they had that playoff experience, which is very, very important due to the fact that the playoffs in the NBA are very, very different to the regular season. The playoffs seem to be a lot more kind of intense, and alongside this, it seems to be a lot more like physical in the playoffs. So however, last season, the Knicks would end up finishing third in the Eastern Conference with a 51-31 record. Obviously a very good record in the Eastern Conference, getting 50 wins. Obviously you're going to make the playoffs, and when they went to the playoffs, they would end up going out to the Pacers in the conference finals. So this is kind of a bit more of a redemption arc for the Knicks, kind of coming back into the playoffs, trying to advance one place further than they did last year when they got to the conference finals. So overall, for the finals itself, I think that this was one of the best finals we have seen in probably like the past 10-15 years. All of the games were basically really close, even though game 1 did have a 10-point differential at the end. Overall, that was still a very close game with both teams kind of taking lead, with basically both teams taking leads and then comebacks being made and everything. It was only really more towards the end where the 10-point differential came about. And in most of these games, there was usually a back and forth going on, and then usually one team would take a big lead and then another team would kind of come and make a comeback at some point, and then it would get to the fourth quarter, and then usually I think that's when the Knicks experience would really show, because they would kind of rally in the fourth quarter and get a big score going on. Then they would end up making the comeback and end up winning basically most of the games, because they ended up winning the series by 4-1. And even though it was a 4-1 series win for the Knicks, it was not that one-sided. I can guarantee you a lot of these games finished within like a couple of scores of each other, except from game 1, which was obviously a bigger point differential in that game. However, like I said, one team would take a lead and then another team would make a comeback, and then for a lot of the game, when it was close, it was really a big back and forth, which obviously for the casual fans is a very entertaining thing, and that's basically what you want in a final series like this. You don't want it to be one-sided like we've seen before. And for this, I think this series was basically decided in the fourth quarter, especially in the last 2 games, in games 4 and 5, because the Knicks would make a historic 29-point comeback in game 4. They were down 29 points and they ended up making that massive comeback that honestly I could see really deflating the Spurs team, because they're such a young team and they don't have the experience yet. That 29-point comeback would basically kind of just crush their morale. However, even though they conceded that 29-point comeback in game 5, they still actually went and played very well, and they did actually manage to get a 15-point lead in that game at some point. But the Knicks once again would rally to only be down 7 in the fourth quarter, and then they would go on a big run in the fourth quarter, including a 10-0 run closer towards the end of the game, to actually end up clinching the NBA championship. So in this final series, you could literally argue it could have gone the other way if a certain shot didn't go in, or if the ball bounced a different way. It was literally that close. You have no idea what was going to happen. The Spurs would literally take like a 10-point lead, and then like a few minutes later, the Knicks would either be back within a score or 2, or they would basically be in front. So it was really one of those series where it was a bit too close to call, even though the Knicks would end up winning by 4-1. And like I said, I just think that overall, the Knicks' experience in the playoffs for the past several years has probably really helped them, because they've been in those situations where they've blown games. They've been in those situations where they just haven't been there when they needed to be, in the crucial moment. And I really do think that having that experience does help, because then you can go back and evaluate what you did wrong, what you can do better, whereas the Spurs really haven't been there. So I think that really did play against them, even though I do think that the Spurs played brilliantly. It's just, I think the Knicks' experience kind of pushed them over the edge and basically made them NBA champions at this point. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on the 2026 NBA Finals. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you think it was a very close series? Do you think it wasn't really that close? And how well do you think both teams played as well alongside this? So yeah, thank you for listening, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.